Hey everyone, in this lecture we're going to talk about exercise metabolism and kind of some of the things that go along with that. So where we're going to start is we first have to understand that there's an energy requirement at rest, and then when we start to move, when we start to exercise, that changes, and that's really kind of what you're looking at is those changes from rest to that exercising state, and then trying to describe those changes and how that affects things. So we really have to start where we're at rest. And so realize at rest, the ATP you produce to uh, stay living, to perform all your normal functions, just sitting here watching this video, are produced by aerobic metabolism. So think glycolysis and then going into the citric acid cycle or Krebs cycle, and then the electron transport chain. And so blood lactate levels are really low because you're not building up this lactate because the pyruvate at the end of glycolysis is being utilized for energy through the citric acid cycle. And so it's going all the way through that, and you're not building up this concentration of lactate because we can utilize it. And so that means that our resting O2 consumption, just sitting here, is about 0.25 liters per minute, or around 3.5 milliliters per kilogram per minute for the average person. That does fluctuate, but that's kind of your averages. And so what happens is as we start to exercise, this is going to change because as soon as you start moving, if you move in your chair a little bit, it's going to take a little bit more ATP to allow those muscles to move. And so that demand is going to change on how much energy is needed. And so those systems are going to start working, and that's going to change the amount of oxygen we need and maybe what fuels we're utilizing and that buildup of lactate depending on the intensity, the speed, how long we're doing it. And so if we go from doing nothing to starting exercise, it'll take our body about 1 to 4 minutes to reach a steady state where everything kind of levels out and the body becomes a little bit happier and it's not trying too hard to catch up. That 1 to 4 minutes ranges on how much of an intensity jump there is and what that activity is and how used to it you are. So after you reach that steady state, ATP requirements are met through aerobic ATP production. So basically, at the beginning of exercise, so if you get up and jump and start running right now, maybe there's a fire somewhere like in your room and you're running out, all of your anaerobic systems are quicker and make ATP much quicker than the aerobic. So those give ATP initially, and then eventually your body's going to settle at a point where those aerobic systems take over. They've kind of ramped up, they've come online, are making a lot more ATP. The others may be a little bit depleted, and so you get to this point where the body's able to function for a longer period of time. It's kind of happy where it's at and not in this kind of panic mode of, oh, we just got to do everything we can to keep going. It reaches this point where it says we're okay. And so that initial ATP production is glycolysis ATP, and then we move into those aerobic system. And so what happens is, if you ever noticed, if you get scared and you start running from something, or you start exercise and you're running really fast to maybe catch somebody, and then you stop, maybe at first you weren't breathing very hard. That first little bit of exercise, you weren't breathing very hard, and then all of a sudden it hits you, maybe even after you've stopped, if it's a very short bout of exercise. And what this is called oxygen deficit. This is the lag in oxygen uptake at the beginning of exercise. So if you went and you sprinted as fast as you could for, let's say, 15 seconds, and then you just stop, what you'll notice is that right as you stop, you might not really be breathing very hard, but then all of a sudden you start breathing really heavily. And that's that oxygen deficit. There was this lag in oxygen uptake at the beginning of exercise, and then it started. If you were to keep running, again, you would notice this not having to breathe very much, and then as you continue in exercise, that breathing increases more and more, and you start to notice it where you didn't at the very beginning. And so this is kind of indicated by this graph here. You do have to pay attention to some of the measurements and some of the things that are going on. But basically, speed, this top graph, it shows someone was at 0 miles an hour, and then all of a sudden their speed jumped up to 7 miles an hour. And so the demand went from not a lot of energy to a whole lot of energy basically within a second. And so what you see here is the ATP demand also changed. It went from very little to very high all of a sudden. So we see this big jump in how much ATP is there. But what we see is that the fact that I'll make sure this is still on screen for you. what we see is the fact that the VO2, the amount of oxygen we're consuming, doesn't jump up immediately because our aerobic systems take time to kind of come on board. And so what you see is this curve here where oxygen was coming up, and then you have this green section, which is the oxygen deficit. Theoretically, for all of our energy to have been made aerobically, what we'd have had to see is that green line jump straight up to this purple dashed line and then maintain a constant level, just like we did with speed and ATP use, but we didn't see that. And so energy had to come somewhere else from other than our aerobic systems as those came online, and that's our oxygen deficit. We didn't have enough oxygen. We didn't utilize enough oxygen to make energy there. And so there's a lot of questions that kind of become at that time course of O2 consumption that they're kind of here with some answers. And so kind of look at those and make sure you understand them. Let me know if you have questions on it. But really, it's asking questions like, why is oxidative phosphorylation not fully activated at the onset of exercise? Well, inadequate O2 supply, so maybe there's just not enough oxygen around those areas for that to happen, or a delayed in turning those on, so just kind of ramping up. Just think about sometimes things have to warm up to be more efficient. Think about like your oven, takes a little time to warm up before you can start cooking at 350 degrees. Kind of the same thing. Everything has to get moving and all those things have to get going is an explanation. And so that's one thing. And that's just kind of what you're looking at there. So what's also interesting is what you see is rapid changes in muscle phosphocreatine levels during the transition from rest to exercise. So right now at rest, you have some really high phosphocreatine levels because it's it's ready to make ATP as soon as it needs to very, very quickly. And at the onset of exercise, we see this very large drop in phosphocreatine levels, mainly because it's making that ATP at the beginning, and then they slowly start coming back up during exercise because your body's taking over aerobically and these systems can regenerate. And you can kind of see those levels kind of dip down and kind of the rate of ATP production with those. So it starts off really strong. We make a lot of ATP with phosphocreatine, and as these levels get lower, we make less and less, but we also don't have to make as much because our aerobic systems are coming on board. So one thing to note is that when it comes to endurance trained athletes, so athletes that run for, let's say, a long distance, they really are training greater than 10 minutes at a time. So think your marathon runner or your long distance runner or cyclist or something, someone who does a lot of endurance training, their oxygen deficit is actually lower. So that green part on the curve is smaller. They don't have as big of an oxygen deficit, and you may be asking why. Well, their aerobic systems are better developed. They're more capable of making more energy and utilizing it. They're more efficient, and so their muscles also have adaptations where they've created more mitochondria, which are all helping them for those systems to come online quicker and then to make more ATP with those systems. And so it just takes it. Their bodies are better able to get there as well. So they've trained in a way that their body knows to use aerobic as much as possible because it's going to help them in the long run with these races. And so they come on quicker. Their body's more efficient at utilizing what's there. And so we see this lower oxygen deficit because they've trained in that way. Where someone who maybe trains anaerobic systems a little bit more, you may see a slightly greater oxygen deficit because their body's phosphocreatine and glycolysis systems happen very, very quickly. And they're not afraid of building up things like byproducts like lactate and depleting those systems because their body usually knows that things are going to stop very quickly and then they can recover those systems. So we have that. We have that oxygen deficit, and then what happens is we hit that steady state, and then eventually we're going to stop that exercise. And so what happens is we stop exercise and we start recovering from it. We have, if you've ever noticed when you stop exercise, maybe you've gone for like a longer run. Short runs can do the same thing, but let's say we do something for 10 to 15 minutes straight. Well, when you stop exercise, most people notice their breathing rate stays elevated for a relatively longer period of time than most people would expect. You don't just, after a couple of seconds, stop breathing heavily. It does get less, but you can notice minutes after exercise that your breathing is still elevated. higher than it was before you started. And so this is where what we have termed oxygen debt. And oxygen debt is simply where our oxygen uptake remains elevated above resting during the recovery of exercise. And so this is kind of initially what it was called, oxygen debt. You'll see that in literature. You may see that in your book. And so the idea was originally is that this excess breathing was just to kind of replenish was equal to your oxygen deficit that you had before. So all of the oxygen you didn't consume at the beginning, you consumed at the end, and it kind of made everything even. The body was back at homeostasis, and then that's when that would stop. But the concept proved to be incorrect over time. So now oxygen debt, if you see that, you're more referring to a newer term that's called EPOC, or excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. And so that's the more recent term. That's what you would see in more recent things that refer to it, and is a better way of describing what's going on. So they're kind of interchangeable. They do mean slightly different things, but EPOC explains things a little bit better because realize that the oxygen debt that is talked about, just the replacing of the oxygen that was not consumed early on, is only about 20% of the EPOC, this excess post-oxygen consumption. Only about 20% of that oxygen consumed is actually needed to replace the oxygen from early on in exercise. And so 80% actually goes to other things. And so what you can see is they're trying to paint that graph. So if you look at this top one, oxygen deficit here, you have EPOC after exercise. So exercise continued or stopped, but oxygen consumption stayed elevated. This inside EPOC area is much larger than your O2 deficit here. And so there are reasons that we see this. There are two phases of EPOC. There's rapid, where there's a very quick decline in how much oxygen you're consuming. And then there's a slow, where this can stay elevated above rest for a long period of time. It takes a long time to come back down. This can be seen in greater effect when you get into something that is above VO2 max. So if the maximum amount of oxygen you can consume is around 3, or 3.5, and this is in liters per minute, but your exercise that you're doing requires 4.5 liters of oxygen to consume a minute in order to perform that exercise, you're never going to reach that. Your body's incapable of it, and so you have this huge oxygen deficit, and you can't keep that up very long. And when you do, you have this greater and more exaggerated EPOC curve as compared to this one. And so it's just trying to give you those extremes to look at it. And again, you have this rapid phase, and you have a slower component, and it's more exaggerated. So if we talk about the rapid portion of EPOC, and this elevated O2 consumption, where it's a little bit steeper and then decreases pretty quickly, this is really used to resynthesize those creatine stores back into phosphocreatine so that you have those ready to go in case something happens again. You can tap back into those to make ATP very quickly. And it's also used to replenish muscle myoglobin. So this is the carrier in your muscles that holds oxygen. So you've got hemoglobin in the blood that carries oxygen, and myoglobin in the muscles that carry those. Well, those can become depleted, and so in this rapid EPOC portion, we're restoring your oxygen stores throughout your blood and your muscles, again, in case you have to go do exercise again very quickly. So the slow portion that lasts for a long time, so the slow portion of EPOC can last for a number of minutes to even on some intense exercise and various things can last hours, multiple hours that your O2 stays elevated above rest. So the increased O2 is needed for the elevated heart rate and breathing. So your heart rate stays elevated for a number of minutes after you're done exercising, and that takes more energy, and so you have to produce more ATP, which is going to need more oxygen, and so you're going to consume that more. Also, your body temperature increases with exercise, and so that increases metabolic rates, and you're going to have to cool yourself, and that's going to take more energy. And so what you're starting to see here is that the O2 that you're consuming afterwards and that staying elevated is all trying to bring yourself back to homeostasis, lower your temperature, lower your heart rate, those types of things. It's helping to process the epin and norepinephrine that increase when you go into exercise, and these increase metabolic rates. And so you're making this ATP and you're utilizing it. It's unstable, it wants to be utilized. And so we see this increased metabolic rate, this O2 consumption as those are going on. We're also converting lactic acid into glucose, and we're starting to do muscle recovery if there's been some muscle damage, and that takes energy when you start to rebuild muscle or repair things that may have gotten injured. Not major injuries like, you broke your leg, but like small little muscle tears or little things that make us stronger and better. Our body has to recover from those, and that's that slow portion. So EPOC is greater for several things. And so if you deplete those PC systems, there's going to be a greater EPOC because it's going to take more O2 to resynthesize that creatine back into phosphocreatine. If your lactic acid in your blood is at a higher concentration, it's going to require more oxygen in order to either process that as fuel or to make new sugar out of that and gluconeogenesis. And so higher intense exercise is going to do that. And so what you see is this EPOC has a lot of things feeding into it that create it, and it's all about kind of getting back to homeostasis after exercise and helping to prep the body for its next bout of exercise. So think about converting lactate into glucose or resynthesizing that creatine into phosphocreatine. So when it comes to our metabolic response in exercise, they are influenced by duration and intensity. And so if we can look at it in kind of different lights. And so metabolic responses to short-term high-intensity exercise are going to be different than typically long-term exercise at a lower intensity. And so 1 to 5 seconds of exercise, so if you do something for anywhere between 1 and 5 seconds and you're doing it at the highest intensity you can, usually that's going to be ATP produced solely from your ATP PC system. As you get into exercise that is greater than 5 seconds, that ATP PC system, it's only good for about 5 seconds maximally, where it can produce the most ATP. It starts slowing down after that. And so we start to shift over into glucose after about 5 seconds. And then if we do an activity and it starts going into 45 seconds, ATP production through ATP and glycolysis and aerobic starts to happen. So aerobic systems are starting to produce more ATP. Glycolysis is wearing out. Phosphocreatine is starting to be depleted. And so you get this transition period. So at about 30 to 45 seconds, we start to transition over. And once we get to, around 60 seconds of exercise, you can kind of see the breakdown here, 70-30. At 2 minutes, we get to 50-50. And then a short time later, eventually your aerobic systems would account for a majority of the ATP being produced. So typically, if we think of prolonged exercise as anything that you do continuously for greater than 10 minutes, ATP production becomes primarily from aerobic metabolism. Steady state oxygen generally will take place. You'll kind of stabilize everything. You'll hit a steady state unless you're exercising too intensely. So if you're exercising near maximal oxygen uptake, maximally what your body can do, we may not see the steady state. These things may not apply, and that's because your body's doing everything it can just to keep going. But eventually, that's going to be what causes you to stop, is your energy systems can't keep up, and your body basically can't keep up, and so it'll kind of peter out, where if we stay at this sub-maximal level and we're able to hit a steady state, we can do it for a really, really long time. And now the goal with like a marathon runner is to hit a very high intensity and get your systems used to being able to hit a steady state there so you can do it for hours on end. And that's what their goal is. Do note that this is typically like in a cool environment or on, kind of like a normal conditions outside. If the environment is very hot and humid, so think summer in Georgia, what we do see is that oxygen uptake tends to drift upwards over time because there's an increase in body temperature of epinephrine and norepinephrine levels. So in a hot, humid environment, something that you could have done and reached steady state and just maintained in a kind of cool environment, what you're going to see is your oxygen uptake increases over time. And this graph kind of shows it here. So in a hot, humid environment, you may start here, and then after a number of times, you just see this drift upwards. And that's just something to be aware of. Or if our exercise intensity is very high, we're also going to see this drift upwards over time in this oxygen uptake because the body's having to work harder to maintain what activity is being performed. The system's having a hard time keeping up. We're not quite able to stay there. So when it comes to all that, we want to kind of start looking at what we call incremental exercise, and this becomes crucial in being able to measure someone's VO2 max and see how well trained they are. And so what incremental exercise is where basically you start at one intensity that's maybe kind of moderate or low intensity, and then after a little bit you step up the intensity. So think about on a treadmill, if you're running at jogging at a comfortable pace, and then every 2 minutes I increase the incline on the treadmill by 2%. So every 2 minutes the exercise gets a little bit more difficult and a little bit more difficult and a little bit more difficult. So we incrementally increase that intensity, or maybe we give longer time frames. Maybe it's every 10 minutes I increase that. So what happens is that what you'll see if you did something like that and we were measuring VO2 is oxygen uptake increases linearly. So for every 2% increase on the treadmill, you would see this increase in VO2, or the volume of oxygen consumed, basically take a stair-stepped climb. Like it would go up, and then the next time we go up 2%, it would go up again, and it would be about the same amount. So as you increase the same amount of work, we're going to see the same linear increase in VO2. And so what's going to eventually happen is eventually you're going to hit your VO2 max, the max amount of oxygen that you can take in and utilize at the cell to make energy. And eventually you'll see that VO2 stop increasing with work rate. So you're going to increase the incline on the treadmill, and you won't see an increase in VO2. And so this is kind of hitting that VO2 max, as you would hear some people call. It's a physiological ceiling. So you may be able to breathe in more oxygen and breathe in more air, but your muscles can't utilize it to make energy. And training and genetics and all kinds of things can influence this. Now that's true VO2 max, but there are also physiological factors influencing that. And so this could be if there's heart things going on, so blood circulation, if there's issues with the lungs and the air circulation, and the ability for muscles to use that are all playing that factor in those physiological limits, but also some comfort levels. So sometimes what could throw this off is maybe someone doesn't feel comfortable when all those things start going on, and that could throw them off. But true VO2 max, what's going to cap this is those physiological factors of the body just can't get the oxygen to where it's needed, or if it is there, the body can't utilize it because the systems just aren't efficient enough. And so what you'd see with something like that incremental exercise test is something along these lines. And so we can actually verify that VO2 max has been achieved if we're testing someone and measuring this. And so what you would truly love to see is something, my screen is, okay. Ideally what you would like to see is this. You'd love to see this on a graph if you plotted it out when you were actually measuring it. Very rarely does that happen. And so sometimes what you're looking for are other things like, are they getting close to their age-predicted max heart rate? What are their blood lactate concentrations? So we know as you get closer to VO2 max, you're producing energy through more glycolysis than the Krebs cycle or through the electron transport chain. And so blood lactate goes up. And we know that if it goes over 8 millimoles, that you're really pushing that glycolysis system and you've maxed out your aerobic systems. We'll talk about something called respiratory exchange ratio. If that gets over 1.1, it means you're producing a lot of CO2, so you're buffering that blood lactate, and so that's the things that are used if you can't see that true plateau. And so this leads us into talking about something called lactate threshold. It's been mentioned in this lecture. And so lactate threshold is the work rate at which blood lactate levels start to rise incrementally with exercise. And so what happens is that if we're in a submaximal level of exercise and your body's able to aerobically make enough ATP to do that, blood lactate, like you have lactate in your blood right now, blood lactate isn't going to really rise. It's not going to change much. But once you get to a place where your body can't fully make enough ATP for you to keep doing what you're doing, with just your aerobic systems and things like glycolysis start having to produce more ATP, and Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain can't keep up with how much lactate it's going to be making, you're going to see this huge increase in lactate with every single incremental increase in exercise. And so this usually occurs around 65 to 80% of VO2 max, depending on whether you're trained or not. And so lactate threshold has sometimes been termed as anaerobic threshold. So it's where your anaerobic energy systems really start producing a lot of ATP. And this then leads to something called OBLA, or the onset of blood lactate accumulation. And this you've experienced if you've ever been doing some exercise for an extended period of time. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, maybe you increase the intensity a little bit, and you just feel your muscles starting to burn. You feel this burning sensation, not lifting weights, but like actually running. All of a sudden, it starts to set in like, my muscles are burning a lot, and they weren't a few minutes ago. And this is because blood lactate is starting to build up, and one of the signals for that is a drop in pH. And that's happening in the muscles you're using the most, and you start feeling that kind of burning sensation in your muscles. I think there's a graph. So what you see here is at this lower level. So at this lower level where you can kind of your aerobic systems keep up, there is a small increase in blood lactate as intensity increases, but it's very minimal. It's really close to rest. Rest is around 1. But then what happens is you hit an intensity, and with that each increase in intensity, you see this massive spike in blood lactate levels. And where those kind of converge, those two kind of lines converge, this is truly lactate threshold. At this point in time, if you go over this train above this percentage of VO2 max, you're going to start building up blood lactate, and that's going to hinder your performance. And so this is a good place to say, like, this is where your aerobic system kind of maxes out and anaerobic starts kicking in to help keep you going for a little while longer. The lactate threshold is really critical. Everyone, let's say we take Olympic marathon runners, all of them have really high VO2s, really, really high VO2 maxes. They can consume a lot of oxygen. But what happens is they have different lactate thresholds. And usually the person with the highest lactate threshold, meaning they can run at a higher percentage of their VO2 max, they can run harder before the pain sets in and they have to slow down in order to keep going. Person with the highest lactate threshold is going to be the one who probably is going to do the best. You could have a really high VO2, but if you start building lactate up at 40 or 50% of that VO2 max, well, you can't do a long endurance activity at a very fast rate because you'll build up lactate and won't be able to continue. And so there's lots of explanations for lactate threshold, from muscle oxygen getting low. So maybe you can't deliver enough oxygen there, and so you can't make ATP using those aerobic systems. It could be a recruitment of more fast twitch fibers that utilize more things like glycolysis to make ATP than they do your aerobic systems like Krebs cycle and electron transport chain. It could be that the fact that lactate removal from the blood is reduced because of everything going on. Your body's just not able to process it. And so you're really looking at those types of things that may help explain some of that. Another thing is that sometimes, and that's that last point, what happens is you start producing more things like NADH through glycolysis, and those have to get brought into the mitochondria through a shuttle. And if that system kind of backs up a little bit and isn't able to transport them as much, that buildup of NADH will actually lead pyruvate to coming into lactate. Like it'll take that hydrogen off and make pyruvate into lactate, and that causes that buildup as well. So if the shuttles, so there's a lot of different pieces that could be affecting it, and it's not saying that one is right and one is wrong. It could be different person to person and what's going on inside of their bodies. And so again, kind of leads into that full system of what lactate threshold and what that looks like. And so one big thing that comes up in this conversation, and a lot of people have heard, is that lactate causes muscle soreness. This buildup of lactate, this burning of the muscles from lactate causes muscle soreness. Well, it actually doesn't. Lactate, when you finish exercise, clears pretty quickly. Most of that lactate is cleared within a couple of minutes. It can take up to 60 minutes to be back at resting levels. But research doesn't support the claim that it causes muscle soreness. If that was the case, anytime a track athlete who runs just 100 meters, they build up a tremendous amount of lactate after sprinting just 100 meters. They would have a tremendous amount of soreness following every training session they did, and it would make it almost impossible for them to work out. And someone who maybe walks or does, maybe goes on a light run, they can feel sore the next day, even though their lactate didn't maybe get very high. So lactate doesn't cause muscle soreness. What usually actually causes OBLA, delayed onset of muscle soreness. Sorry, not OBLA. DOMS, delayed onset of muscle soreness. DOMS, DOMS. OBLA, we talked about before. And so onset of blood lactate accumulation. What really is happening for muscle soreness is microscopic muscle tears. So when you use your muscles, they tear slightly. And so we get sore from that because it releases some things in our body and hurts nerve endings. The body puts those back together stronger. And so that actually is what's causing us to build muscle mass and to get stronger and faster is these microscopic injuries. But we feel those. It's not coming from the lactate. It's coming from little micro tears in our body. And so that's one thing to kind of note as we go forward. So when it comes to lactate threshold, is there a practical use? Yeah, we can predict performance, which we had already talked about here. Also, knowing lactate threshold in professional athletes allows us to kind of note training intensity, allows you to match this up with kind of heart rate so that someone can train right at lactate threshold, go above and below, and slowly work their lactate threshold up so that they can basically go at a higher intensity for a longer period of time to compete and become a better whatever sport that is. I keep using running, but it's anything that you're doing, especially for an extended period of time greater than 10, 15 minutes. And so this is just a graph that shows kind of removal of blood lactate, and that's important because some people don't like to cool down very much or do exercise after their workout. And so what this shows is that blood lactate, having a high level of blood lactate is not the most comfortable thing in the world. It doesn't cause muscle soreness, but it's not comfortable. And so if you don't do exercise, it takes a long time. It takes longer for that lactic acid to clear out. But if you do light exercise, what you see is this quicker clearing of the lactate coming out of the blood and getting back to baseline, which just helps you to feel more comfortable. It also helps the body reach homeostasis a little bit more. And what's really occurring here is the fact that your body's taking that lactic acid, converting it back to pyruvate and using it as energy, and then also using some of it to make glucose. So we'll stop this one here, and our next lecture will pick up with the estimation of fuel utilization during submaximal exercise.